Hey, welcome everyone. My name is James Serra. I'm an architect at the New York City MTC, the Microsoft Technology Center, focused on data and AI. And today I'm going to present Power BI, an overview, deployment, and governance. So switching to my presentation, this topic has become very popular among customers. I spend most of my time in customer engagements where they are implementing Power BI, and it's such a large project, they're not quite sure the best approach for governance, for deploying it, for security, for governance. And so I have a lot of conversations with them, and that is where this deck has come from. I've been doing this quite a long time, and I've been at Microsoft 7 years now, all focused on data and AI. And as an architect, I spend a lot of time in architect design sessions, and the majority of those recently have been on Power BI. Today, we'll talk about the product at a high-level overview. We'll go over deployment strategies. We'll talk about common usage scenarios that I see. We'll talk about Power BI, the data storage and data refresh options you have, how to deploy to dev, test, and prod environments. We'll have a discussion on sharing and end it with a discussion on administration. A lot of what I talk about today is also discussed on my blog, with the link is there. So if you want deeper dive in some of these topics, you can make sure to check out my blog. Power BI overview. So we think of Power BI at a high level, we have all this data. It could be cloud data, it could be on-prem data, it could be from various different source systems, homegrown applications, it could be social media data, CRM, ERP. The idea is we want to pull all this into Power BI, and we want to have these reporting, this real-time dashboards, so we can make better business decisions with this data, so we can gather more insights into whatever it may be, our company, our product line. And then we also want a number of ways to view this, so not only through Power BI itself, but through reports on the web or mobile or Excel or embedded in some application in there, and we'll talk a lot about these. If we look at Power BI portfolio of what is involved, Power BI Desktop is the main one. This is where you're going to do your authoring and creating the reports. You are eventually going to publish this out onto the Power BI service. So this is where there's a Microsoft tenant. This tenant is an area carved out in Azure for your company. So most companies have one tenant, but that just means a specific portal where other people in your company can log into to view these reports. Power BI Premium is sort of more of a licensing issue, where you can save a lot of money if you have a certain amount of users, where you can get additional features like dedicated capacity and increased performance that I'll talk about. Power BI Report Server is this on-premise report server. So if I want to publish my reports, but I'm not yet able to do that in the cloud, I can publish them on-prem. And then Power BI Embedded is a product that allows you to take the reporting engine of Power BI and put it within a web application. So it seems like it's something that you may have built, but it's actually using Power BI engine. So it gives the appearance of something that's just smoothly integrated with your application, but yet it's using the full functionality of Power BI. And I'll touch on these in the upcoming slides. So the Power BI desktop is what you'll use to create your reports. You can do your own slicing and dicing of the data. However, that's specific to one person on there. So you'll do all this, you create the reports, and then you publish it out to Power BI service where others can see it, where you can publish the reports, and then you can take pieces of those reports and create dashboards from them, such as the one you see on the screen here. Desktop and Power BI service each have on their own features. Some of them they both can do, like reporting, because you can even in the Power BI service do some report creation. So we recommend we do it on desktop because it's got more features on that. So on the other end, the Power BI service has dashboards, which you don't have in Power BI desktop. So you'll be doing some of the blending of the two, But be aware from this slide, some things you can do in both and some things are separate in each of these products. And then Power BI Premium being that dedicated service that you get where you can not only save a lot of cost, but you can get some additional features. And I'll share what those additional features are in a bit. But this becomes a very cost-effective solution when you have a number of users in the hundreds that are going to be using Power BI reports, whether to create reports or to view them. And then Power BI Report Server becomes an on-prem solution for publishing reports. It doesn't have as many features as the Power BI service, like dashboards, but I see a lot of companies using this as sort of a stopgap in between the ability to publish to the web. So they can publish it locally within their on-prem environment, and then when the day comes when they can publish to the web, it's really just redeploying those reports. So it's very little effort to go from on-prem report server into the Power BI service. So it can be that one stepping stone before you get into the cloud. And then the Power BI Embedded, as you see on here, you can have this report engine and interface it with API calls. So you can have buttons outside of Power BI that can be used to change the color. And when a user clicks on it, you write the code to call an API in Power BI and make that color change on there. So it gives the illusion that it's part of your application when it's really Power BI underneath the covers. So we see a lot of customers using this if they want to control aspects outside of Power BI in their own interface, as well as for security. So you can say, I'm going to only allow certain people to log into this web application and use the Power BI reports. When we look at the Power BI data sources, you see there's tons of them, over 100. And I recently updated this slide to show you how many direct drivers it has into various sources in there. And Power BI updates every month, so you'll see one or two new ones appear every month. So it's great right out of the box to connect with just about any data source you can think of. Deployment strategy. The idea is we want to think of going from personal BI, where I'm building something just for me, then deploying it out for my team, which consists of maybe half a dozen or so people. And we all collaborate to build and develop these reports and view them. And then at some point, we want to publish those reports for the corporate BI to see other people within our company to view those reports. And this can involve reports, it can involve other storage systems, such as AAS, Azure Analysis Services in there. But think of it in these three contexts as we go along, that you'll have personal BI, team BI, and then corporate BI. And the idea is we want to have a blending of those. So we don't want to go and just have either all end users or business end users are building reports to the other extreme that only IT is building and is a corporate BI. We want to sort of blend those two together, and that's what we're going to focus on today. The idea is I can have end users create reports and deploy them, and then I can have corporate IT that could do the same thing, but also monitor and administer all those reports in there. And a lot of the Power BI today now could be used in conjunction with those two different sides of people, the business users and the IT people on there, to come in this blended approach. And these are decision points you want to think of when you're going to build out an environment, is ask these questions. Who's going to consume the reports? How are they going to consume them? What are their usage patterns? What is acceptable latency in pulling up reports and slicing and dicing them? So make sure to answer all these questions, because that's going to guide you in choosing one of the architectures that I'm going to come up with for your deployment on there. So very important to have these questions answered beforehand. When you look at rolling out Power BI on there, you're going to have your corporate BI that's going to set up this infrastructure, and then they're going to work with the end users, the business-led self-service BI. And the idea is to work together to come up with a proper architecture. So make sure you get the end users, the business people, involved in this architecture, because it's very important for them to understand and have some input into it. The capacities of this, to touch on premium again, is you see some of the differences. So this is something important to know right away. And the big difference is the imported data size in here. With the Pro licensing, you get 1 gigabyte, and with the Premium, you get 10 gigabyte. Now, this is compressed, so the data size can actually be much higher than this. But in Power BI, all the interface, when you import it, is in memory. So the idea is that's how it gets a millisecond response time, is we have all this in memory, and we limit the size of that piece that you can import to 10 gigabytes. And there's other features on here that you'll see that are part of Premium that are not in the Pro. But that 10 gigabytes has changed. Now we have what's called large models in public preview, where you can use up to a 400 gigabytes size now. So imagine this is also compressed, meaning maybe I can pull in data that's a terabyte or more in size. And this 400 is going to keep increasing. And this right now is going to allow you to import a lot of data sets all into Power BI without having going around these workarounds, which I'll talk about, which are very effective too. But keep in mind, we have 400 gigabytes in public preview right now. Here's a list of those Power BI Premium Benefits that you'll get outside of Pro licensing in there. So make sure you know these. And if you're going to use any of these features, you'll have to look into getting a Power Premium license on there. But there's so many things. I would say 95% of everything you can do is in the Pro. It's going to the Premium for a handful of additional features, for consistent performance, but mostly for cost reasons. So what are the common usage scenarios? This is all based on a couple of white papers. There's one here called Planning a Power BI Enterprise Deployment and Security. So if you want more detail of what I'm talking about, in addition to my blog, is check out this white paper. It's a very large, couple hundred pages on there, so it goes very deep into some of the things I'm going to talk about today. And you'll see there's other white papers that you'll find out there that could be very informative when you're somebody building out a Power BI deployment. Some definitions to make you aware of. When we talk about My Workspace, you'll see this as the default. When you deploy something, you have the choice of doing it to My Workspace. And this is where you're going to want to put reports and dashboards that are really only for your eyes. And it could be it's a great starting point for testing reports and dashboards. But eventually you'll move out to a Power BI app workspace, where this is where you collaborate. You'll create a separate workspace compared to My Workspace, maybe by subject area. And then you'll have maybe a handful of other people who can access that and create their own reports and edit them. So you have this one workspace that's specifically for a small group. Then when you get to a point where everything is rock solid in there and you want to share it with others, those reports, you can publish it as an app. So we have the Power BI app, and you can have your own level of security on there. So it's likely it'll be read-only for these reports, and you'll publish a subset of what you had in the app workspace out to the rest of your company in that view-only format. Collaboration and sharing. This is where collaboration comes, where you're copying this data, these reports to others. Or I'm sorry, collaborating is where you're allowing them to access the data that you have in a workspace. And then sharing is where you're going to copy it out to others so they can also share it, but outside of your app workspace. And then we have distribution, which is the ability to copy the data out to others, and they can use the copy of that. So we'll talk about the difference between collaboration, sharing, and distribution as we go along. Here's Power BI and how it interfaces with desktop, with the service at a high level. The idea is I'm going to take all these source systems that have this data, and I'm going to import it into Power BI Desktop when I'm creating my report for the first time. Inside Power BI Desktop, I'm going to create the report using visualizations. I'm also going to create a data model. And that model is called a dataset. And that is where I clean the data using Power Query. That is where I add to it. Maybe I'm combining fields, I'm creating calculations. And the Power Query is used to clean the data. Once I get to the point that I want to share it, I can publish that out to the Power BI service in the cloud or locally the Power BI report server. And then we also have Power BI mobile app, which is very functional and can be used to view anything that's sitting in the Power BI service or the report server. So this is at a high level. Now I'm going to talk about variations. of this view. The first is the personal Power BI. This is where it's just me, and I'm going to go and use Power BI desktop. I'm going to pull in all this data, I'm going to clean it, I'm going to mash it up together, and then I'm going to publish it out to a Power BI service into my own workspace just for me. I can use the Power BI mobile app to check it out. I also have the ability to use an on-premise data gateway. And what this is used for is I will take data from a data source, import it into the Power BI desktop, and publish that data out along with the metadata of the reports and the data, and the reports and the queries. I also publish out the data. So that data is stale from that point I publish it. And of course, you're going to want to update that data. So how do you do that if the data is on-prem? Well, you can use an on-premise data gateway. So that's for security reasons. And I can schedule a refresh. So every day, every hour, I want to update that data sitting in the Power BI workspace, which I'll talk more about. But the on-premise gateway gives you the functionality to update that data even if it's on-prem. You don't need the gateway in most cases if the data is already in the cloud, but you certainly need it for on-prem data sources. Next up is small team collaboration. So thinking of, I created this report, but I want to share it with a handful of other people. So I create a new workspace in Power BI, maybe by subject, and I publish out to that instead of my workspace. And now I allow others to access my workspace. So maybe I'm giving a handful of people write access because they want to create reports or update what you've done. Maybe another handful that can read it so they can go and see whether the report is accurate and valid. And they can also access this from the Power BI mobile app. And then there are certain connections you can make that allow them to update that data. So they can go through the on-premise data gateway and you can refresh that data sitting in this workspace. Stepping up from that is when we have a larger team. So say I publish these reports to my local group of people, and then we say we want to share this among everybody else in the company. So this is where we will publish this at this workspace. And you don't have to publish everything. You can say, well, I created 20 different reports and 10 different dashboards, but I only want to publish out half of those to the specific group of people in app. And you can mix and match them. So you can publish some of those reports and dashboards in one app and some of the other ones in a different app in there, and then give different read and write access to those applications. Most time it'll be read access, and this is the way you can limit. You can say, I created 20 reports, but only 10 of these should be HR people, and then the other 10 should be financial people, and I can separate them out, publish them in 2 separate apps, and then give them viewer access to all those. And of course, they can use their Power BI mobile app, and of course, I can use this on-prem data gateway to schedule refreshes for those. Going one step further, this is where I can have more of an enterprise level and where I will use Power BI Premium capacity for that. So if I have a lot of users, again, for cost reasons, I want to use a premium capacity because I can also have people outside my company access this data. So this is where Azure Active Directory, the B2B, business to business, can be set up so I can have people in a different company still log into my tenant and see those reports. So now we're getting a lot of people in addition to the company people, and that's where premium capacity may be a better value for you. But the key point is that you don't have to limit to just the people within your company to see the Power reports. One way of a few ways is that they can log into your site and see that application that you've published out and view those reports and dashboards. Centralized datasets. So this is something that is fairly new in the Power BI report, is that I want to create datasets that are shared among many different people. So instead of, for example, having a person go in and build a data set and build a report, and then somebody else coming in that's creating a report that's somewhat similar, but while the report's different, the data set may be the same, and you don't want them to go and create their own data set, and now you have a lot of duplication of effort. So what you can do is create workspaces that are a collection of data sets that are built by people who are responsible for the data modeling, and separate those out from people who are responsible for creating the reports, and then have a centralized place where they can go and view those data sets. So we can have workspaces, maybe an HR workspace that has a whole bunch of HR data sets and such. So this makes it a lot easier for people to go build reports because they're not having to create those data sets. And then also, so that's one way of centralizing the data because everything goes through this one particular data set. I can also use an analysis service and DirectQuery, which I'll touch on, as a way to centralize data. But data sets become a very popular way to centralize that data. So you're not having many people using many different access points to get to that data. They're all going through that one data or handful of data sets. We also have a feature within Power BI that's fairly new called data flows. So the idea, and this is almost separate feature than you would think of report writing. This is a feature focused on collecting and cleaning data and landing into a data lake or a common data model, which is a way to land data in the data lake using a pre-built data model. When I use data flows, when I create one, it'll take data that's sitting in the source system, use Power Query to clean it, and then I choose where to land it in a data lake. And I can match up that data with a common data model, say healthcare on there. So instead of having to create your own data model, there's these ones that are pre-built for you. You don't have to use them, but it can be a great shortcut. And so the idea is if we have people creating these data flows, I can use that as a starting point for building out my data sets and then my reports. So I don't have to clean the data. Somebody's already done it for me. So you can think through this about the best way to implement this in your company. But data flows allow you to pull in data, clean it, and land it into data lake, and then build on top of that. We can also use that data flow and share it so we have multiple data sets that can use that data flow. So if we look at this slide right here, well, I created this data flow. I now have multiple Power BI desktops that are connecting to that data flow and creating data sets. So this gives you the benefit of reducing the duplication of effort, as well as the ability to flow in the future changes to the data flow. So if I go in and I have a data flow and I update it, any of those data sets that are using that data flow will also be updated. So if I pull in data again into the data flow, if I schedule it to be updated, then all the data sets on top of that will also be updated in there. So it cascades through. So it's a great way to then, again, to minimize your effort and duplication of effort by setting up a data flow. When we look at what's supported in the data flow, you see here there's a lot of them, but not as much as you saw in the previous slide with the drivers in there. So this is also being updated every month with one or two of these on there, but be aware that not every source system is supported through a data flow. Power BI also has templates. So this is a great shortcut procedure for a company. So you can have a handful of people that go and create these templates in there. So it can have some corporate color scheme or branding or commonly used data sources can all be put in this template, and you can share this. And then when end user goes in, they can say, I want to start off with a Power BI report using a template. A lot of the work can already be done for them. So keep that in mind, and then maybe create a group of people that are in charge of creating the templates that are shared among other people in the company. There's also custom visuals. So as you're going to Power BI, there's a lot of visuals built in, but if you're finding that there's a certain visual that you want to use that's not in the default, you can go out to the Power BI visuals, and there's a marketplace where other people have uploaded visuals that they've created. Most of these are free. Some of them could be pay. You can also say, I want to create visuals, but just use them for my organization. So that's why we have that tab on there. So the idea is now you're enhancing Power BI, and we're using the power of the community to create these additional visuals. So you always want to go and check out what's available to you. So you can maybe say, oh, I found a visual that'll make it more appropriate for what I'm trying to build out and show other people. For example, the word cloud is a popular one in there. It's not built in the Power BI, but you can easily just go to the marketplace and pull that visual in and start using it. So some ideas of how Workspace is. So I showed in the previous ones, you have My Workspace, and then you'll create other workspaces that are used within your group. In most cases, I see companies using that by a project. So they say, we're going to have a new project. It needs a bunch of reports and dashboards. Let's put together a dozen or so people and have them build out those reports. And that's how they separate out their workspaces. And at the same time is shared data sets. So instead of having all these different groups create their own data sets, they come up with, hey, let's have a smaller amount of people go and build out these data sets, and then we create workspaces. So we can have a workspace that's HR data sets and finance data sets on there. So there's other ways of doing it, but these are the two most common ways I see customers doing today. And then separating out those data and reporting workspaces, I mentioned this is a screenshot of an architecture of how you want to do that. So I have this one centralized data set here, and I build out desktops that are all using this data set, and these are within their own workspaces. So you notice in this workspace we have dashboards and reports, but we don't have data sets in there. That's because I'm going to use a data set in another workspace. So that's important to understand is data sets can be shared among different workspaces. They can even be shared among different premium capacities if you're using that functionality. So it prevents that duplication of effort and makes it a lot easier to have people use a data set that has been certified, which we'll talk about. So keep that in mind when you're building out. You're very likely going to want to start out where having your workspaces that are just data sets. And then you're separating the apps out there. So you'll have a workspace where you'll have those dashboards and reports, and you publish them out. And the good thing is this also allows control to update the apps on a less frequent basis that you may update the workspace. So example, if I create a workspace and I just had everybody access that, and I'm in there every day updating dashboards and reports, it can get confusing for people to see these reports changing per day. If I publish the app out, then what that means is I can go ahead and continue updating the workspace because people are using the app, and then maybe once a week, say every Sunday night, I go and I publish the app with those changes that I've made during the week. So it allows a good separation and reducing the confusion that can have from updating it too frequently. How should I store my data? So there's a few options within Power BI for this, and I listed them here. The idea is we can import the data that I talked about. We also can use this feature called DirectQuery that allows me to go and keep the data as it is sitting in a source system and query it when I need to, and then pull it into Power BI and just pull in the results of that query. So this allows you to have the ability to pull in data that's much larger than can fit into that 1 gigabyte or 10 gigabyte or 400 gigabyte import level or roof that we have. And then we also have live connection that allow you to connect to Azure Analysis Service or SSIS. And then we have what's called composite models and aggregations as yet another way to store data, and I'll show those in the upcoming slides. So importing the data, as I mentioned, you publish data, you import the whole data set into Power BI service. This will work great unless you have a really large data set. So then what happens? Well, then you have the option of using DirectQuery. So this allows you to keep the data as is in that source system. And in this case, that source system could be Azure SQL Database. So imagine I have billions of rows of tables that will never fit in Power BI service in memory. It could be 50 terabytes of data. Well, not a problem. I can have DirectQuery. So when I set the data model up this way, and it's just a switch, whenever somebody writes a query, instead of looking in memory for it, it'll go into the source system. Now, of course, the trade-off is speed. Because it's got to push the query down, run it, and then return the results in there, it could take longer than it was in memory. It will take longer in there. So we have solutions around that, but this could be very useful. Even to the point where I can import data and aggregate it all, and then I can say, well, I want the ability to drill a detail. And so the aggregated data could sit in memory, but when you go drill the detail, because it's billions of rows, then it'll use a direct query. So this is where the composite model comes in that I'll talk about in a minute. Direct query is supported in a lot of systems, but not everything, so be aware of that. When you're designing your system, make sure if you need to use direct query that your source system supports it. The composite model. So this allows us to use a table, our source system, and choose whether it's going to be direct query or import, whether I'm going to bring it in memory or I'm going to keep it as it is. Now, the great thing that came out with these composite models about a year ago was I can combine them. I can have tables that are being imported and as well as tables that are kept on the source system for direct query in there. So imagine a star schema where I have a fact table and many dimension tables. Those dimension tables are usually small. Let's import them. And then the fact table is going to be, could be billions of rows, so let me use direct query for that. Behind the scenes, the query planner that is used for Power BI will know the best approach to take. Maybe you're asking a query that's going to combine direct and import, and I want to push down all that data. So the dimensions, maybe I want to push it down into that source system and run it there, or maybe I want to pull in that source system into memory, part of it, and query it and join the fields together that way. So it'll do all that for you. The cool thing too is I can have multiple direct query sources and multiple import sources. So I can have a query that's going against a handful of import and a handful of direct query, and they could be completely different sources. No problem, it can handle all that. With the exception of there's a couple of sources that can't use composite models listed here, and then Power BI Datasets and Azure Analysis Services, in a few months, they will be available to use them. Aggregations, this is a great new feature that came out recently. So the idea is it doesn't have to be an all or nothing situation where I pull in all of the data in the memory or I keep it in direct query. I can create aggregation tables. Think of these as sort of mini cubes or mini tabular models where if I have billions of rows, but I know that these dashboards are going to run queries that are going to have summations, and I know what those summations are, what I can do is create an aggregation table that have those summations. So you're pre-building all this. And then again, the query plan can know if I submit a query, it's going to look at that and go, oh, you know what? You want a query of a sum that's already in an aggregation table, so I'll use that. If it's not in there, it'll go and use the direct query to that source system. So it's smart enough to know that you don't have to specifically say I want to use an aggregation table. So an aggregation tables, because it's just aggregations, you can sum up a lot of data and put it in there, and you can create multiple aggregation tables and you can level them out. So this gives you the ability to query data that's billions and billions of rows in milliseconds without having to sacrifice queries that don't support the aggregation tables. It can go to the direct query. So it's a great way to have the best of both. So how do I refresh my data? When I'm using import mode, I touched on it previously that I can import data on a recurring basis on there, so I can schedule it. So looking a little bit more into that, you can also manually refresh it. Now this caused a little confusion because when you manually refresh it, you want to manually refresh the data set. Different than the refresh in the report. The refresh in the report just refresh the visuals. So rarely you ever need to do that, except unless in the use cases where you're looking at the report and somebody refreshes the data set and you want to get the latest, you just hit the refresh button to see that. But most times, the refresh is going to happen when a lot of people are not looking at the report. And what'll happen is when I hit that refresh now, it goes through, updates the data set, and any reports that are using that data set will now get that latest data on there. So you can see I have a refresh history on there. So in theory, you can use this all the time, but who wants to go and manually click a button for all these different data sets? And that's why we have the schedule refresh. So you can go in here and say, hey, every day I want to go and update this data at night. So the end user doesn't have to go and manually click it and then wait for that report to update, which could take a number of minutes. So this is where you set up the schedule refresh. The premium capacity allows you up to 58. When you do a manual refresh, it doesn't count against that. So you're limited to 8 in Power BI Pro, so be aware of that. If If you need more than that, you'd have to either manually refresh or go to Power BI Premium. So it schedules refreshes, and be aware that if I say to run at 5 o'clock, it's going to run within 15 minutes of that. So something to keep in mind. And as I said before, we have this Power BI gateway. So this allows me to go and query data that's on premise. And there's a personal and standard mode of Power BI queries. So we see the differences here. Dive in if you want to see more about how those two are different. But this is a great way to add in the security to allow you to continue to update data, whether it's on-prem or it's in the cloud. So deploying to dev and test and prod. There's one way you can handle this dev, test, and prod is I can just say I'm going to publish out to a workspace, and I'm going to then take that workspace and publish an app. So the app is production. The workspace, you can think of it as a dev and test environment. So maybe you invite other people to your workspace to test it all out. And then when they say it looks good, you just publish it out to production, your production app in there. So there's pros and cons of that. I leave that as a takeaway to go into more details of this. So this is, I'll see companies using this if they don't have many reports to start out with, but this can be problematic because you have to give people access to the workspace to test things out, and you may not want to do that. So this is where we get into the next level of separating out workspaces and apps, and having workspaces that are dev, test, and prod, and then have applications that are dev, test, and prod on there. And you can manually control this, meaning I can go into a workspace, update it, and then say, okay, it looks good. I want to publish as an app into a test environment and let people test it. And when they give the okay, I can then go into the production workspace by publishing out what was in dev or test into the workspace that's a prod workspace, and then publishing that out to the prod app when I get to go ahead. However, Microsoft has come out with a simpler way of doing that, and that is through this lifecycle management, which is in public preview. So this allows you to create a workspace where what I just explained you do manually, you create a pipeline that can do it programmatically, where I can go in here and through this interface, I can set up a pipeline where I say I want to use this workspace I've created called DID, Dashboard of the Day, and it will create a test and production environment for you. It'll make copies of those. You can rename those, but it'll create those copies and link them together automatically. Then you start publishing data out into your workspace that's for dev, and it'll keep track of the data sets, reports, and dashboards you're using. Then it'll compare to what you have out in the test environment. So you'll see a list of what's different between the two. And when you say, I'm at the point where I want to publish it, you just click the deploy to the test, and it will publish those out to test. From there, I can publish an app into a test app environment, and then next I can deploy it to production, and then publish the app into production in there. So this makes it a lot easier for end users or for IT to control the process of moving data through dev, test, and prod. So that would look like this. I would publish data to a workspace that's dev. Then I would publish it to a workspace when I get to go ahead, that's okay, into a test. And then from test, I would go to the workspace. So there's pros and cons that you should be aware of as a takeaway to read those. But we're finding a lot of customers are really taking to this. You can also use APIs to create your own production or development pipeline that you want to build out that I showed before. And I've seen some customers get pretty fancy in what they've built out because of those APIs. But what we got right out of the box will handle most end users. Next up is sharing. So what I want to talk about that is the different ways we have of taking the reports and dashboards you create and either allowing people to access those same reports and dashboards or to publish copies of those out for others to then view and share among themselves. So when we look at sharing, as I mentioned before, we have to think of the ability to share. That means have everybody access your one report or dashboard in there, and then distribution, where we're creating a copy of that content. And when we look at which way to go as far as how to distribute this data or share it on there, we have a couple of options on, or actually 12 different options. And I blogged about this, and to cover a few of them is the idea is what kind of permissions are needed is one of the decisions you're going to make. What type of content is it? Official? Who's going to view it? And how many are they going to view? Goes into it. But be aware there's a lot of options on there. Things like I can even take reports and dashboards and save them as a PDF or into PowerPoint. One that's very popular is saving these reports and dashboards into Microsoft Teams on there. So make sure you're aware of all these options. And importantly, too, is make sure you know about the security around all these options. We'll get into admin in a little bit of how to prevent these things. But if you're not aware that people can, for example, save something as a PDF, and it could be data or PII information on there, you need to maybe turn that option off on there. So make sure you understand the options and then the security behind those options. When we look at the data set, this is a common practice now is to share that. So the idea is I have a data modeler, and they create a data set, and that data set is then used for others to build reports off of that. And then you have a number of reports that are based on this one data set on there. So the good thing too about this is if the data set changes, that'll be propagated into those Power BI desktop reports. And then those reports will be updated too on there. So think of how you want to design the group that's going to do the data sets, and think of the permissions you want to give for these data sets. Do you want people to only read those data sets? Do you want people to modify those data sets? And then maybe group those data sets together by things like subject matter or by project. The data sets, and here's where it gets really interesting, is I can say, okay, I'm going to have a group of people create data sets. But how do I mark that those data sets are at a point where they are single source of the truth, where they are certified? And this is where we have two levels within Power BI, where I can say I want to promote this data set. So thinking of this as it's at a point where maybe we're in a testing environment and it's almost ready for general use, but it's not at the point that it's certified. And anybody can go and create data sets and promote them, but then you may have a level of people in IT that will officially certify a data set, and then it sort of comes with a warranty that this is guaranteed to be accurate in there. So this is one way of doing it. You can certainly come up with other ideas in your company, but what will happen is when you go into Power BI report and you say, I want to use a data set, you'll see the screen on the right, and it'll have those ones that are endorsed, and they'll bubble up to the top. So you can search for those data sets that are only promoted or certified. So jumping into that, how do I administer Power BI? And a lot of companies have broken out the thought process of how do I govern through the idea that we have a user community of everybody. Underneath that, we have people who are considered authors of the content, consumers of the content, and then people that admin or administrators of the content. Underneath that, the author people, we have authors who are IT based and others that are business based. And then on admin, we have people that are adminning various things, maybe the tenant or the capacity on there. And there are many different administrators. We have administrators at the Microsoft 365 level, so combining more than just Power BI, but other products within the 365 ecosystem. And then we have administrators who are specific to Power BI, who can be handling different aspects of Power BI, whether they're handling all the tenant level settings or just who can view reports, or handling the capacity, or controlling the aspects of a workspace. So there's a lot of ways this can be broken out. And this is where you get into creating maybe a center of excellence of how you want to divide these responsibilities. And they don't all have to be separate people. You can have one person have multiple responsibilities depending on how big your company is. But think of the responsibilities and then assign them to somebody. And then, of course, this interfaces heavily with Azure Active Directory. So you're going to want to have the person that's in charge of putting in groups and users in Active Directory heavily involved in the admin side of Power BI. Because generally you'll create groups and then give them privileges to say be a Power BI Workspace administrator, and then put people in those groups. So it makes it easier to control the permissions that way. When we look at the level of administration you can do, you can start off as you have somebody who is at the tenant level, and then the capacity, and then this goes through and shows you that you have workspaces and dashboards and reports and all the various administration roles that can control those pieces of that. So very important to understand that, including the part where you're giving the workspace roles that are broken into these four. So you want to make sure you understand these, because too often you'll see somebody give somebody, say, contributor access, thinking that they can't copy a report or edit a workspace, and finding out they can do. So make sure you know these really well. Then create a group that's assigned this particular role, and then add people to that group. Under administration tenant settings, you can see there's a whole bunch of different options here. So this is where you want to get familiar, and you want to look at things like, well, should we allow people to publish PDF reports? As I said before, there's a setting for that. Understand what's there by default, and then work on making those adjustments. On one hand, you don't want to allow people to do everything. On the other hand, you don't want to lock down everything, because you can even lock down people creating workspaces, which can cause a lot of pushback on there. So understand the data that needs to be controlled, the ways to share and distribute that data, and then adjust the settings accordingly. Under the Power BI service, there are a lot of ways to get metrics on what's happening behind the scenes. I can look at individual report metrics and dashboards. I can look at the tenant level metrics. I can go into activity logs on there, whether they're by Power BI or Office on there. Be aware that there's retention periods for these. So what customers will do is they need to hold this data longer, they'll take the data and move it into, say, a SQL database where they can have it indefinitely, and they can continue creating historical reports on this data. Here's an example of report usage metrics, which is simply anybody with privilege can go and they click on view metrics, and they can view an individual report, or they can view at a high level all the dashboard and reports under a workspace. We also have the tenant, so at an even higher level you can see the number of dashboards and users created, and you can see who's busy, and maybe use this to get feedback on those people because they are using a lot to see what else is needed within this workspace as far as dashboards and reports that are not in there. There's also a ton of audit logs. So anything you want to capture can be captured. You'll see it output into a JSON file, which you can then pull into a Power BI report and create metrics on metrics. And the good thing is, from this list here, you can see you can trace anything that somebody's done. If you want to find out who deleted the report, who edited the report, who renamed it, anything you can think of is possible is captured in here. So it's a great tool to go and see for auditing purposes or for metrics by using this audit log. So there's a way to limit what you see in the activity log, because it can get crazy in there if I'm looking at everything related to Office 365. So we got SharePoint, Exchange, Dynamics. If I want to limit it to just Power BI, this was recently introduced. There's an activity log just for that. So there's some differences to be aware of, but I see a lot of customers building reports or doing investigation auditing going through the Power BI activity log. And finally, be aware of the roadmap features. This is another great thing. Microsoft is very transparent in what they're working on. So you can go to this release plan that can show you all things they're working up all the way up to March on there. So many months in advance. This can be viewed through an online PDF or through a release wave that allows you to go and search for features and click on them to get more details of what is coming down the pipe. If there's something that you like, you can go and upvote it, or you can create a poll or upvote something that's not in this release plan that you may want to use by clicking on some of these links. So Microsoft is very driven on community feedback. So make sure you go and share your thoughts, enter comments, or vote for new features. And then finally, I have some slides on here, resources. These are the ones that I collected that are most popular. So I got a handful of slides that you can use as a follow-on to further investigate the features and products that you can use within Power BI, as well as communities that can help you understand the product better. And then finally, email me if you have any follow-up questions. Happy to answer them via that email. And again, make sure to check out my blog for further details on some of the topics I talked about today. So thanks so much for attending, and my pleasure to serve you.